So we appreciate your presence. My name is Paul Cavanaugh, and I work with Dr. Wilson at the Center for Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. And I work in grants. And Dr. Wilson is a very prolific grant developer. I don't like to use the word grant writer, because really putting together a proposal involves a lot more than just writing. But I'm very fortunate that I'm accompanied by Ms. Jen Cotting, who's the director of the Environmental Finance Center. And I just wanted to make clear that the Environmental Finance Center is in the School of Architecture. The Center for Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health is in the School of Public Health. And we are very close colleagues, but the Environmental Finance Center personnel is not in the organizational structure of the Center for Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health, and vice versa. We're two separate centers on the University of Maryland campus. So I just wanted you to understand that Jen is not my boss, and I'm not Jen's boss, but we're colleagues, and we have a lot of similar interests. So I handed out the slides that we presented at the first and second grant writing workshops. And you should have those there, and the presentations are online. This third presentation is going to be very different. Dr. Wilson asked us to take you through an actual live RFP, request for proposals, which was related to environmental justice and health. And so we found a request for proposals from USDA as far as and support of community food programs. I'm not an expert in community food programs, but a proposal is a proposal. And so we'll be going through the USDA proposal, and you'll see how it relates to the previous two grant workshops. I'll let Jen introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Paul, for that introduction. That was great. I'm Jen Cotting, Director of the Environmental Finance Center here at the University of Maryland. We are actually a regional center, so we work throughout the Mid-Atlantic, and we help communities figure out how they're going to pay for the natural resource protection and restoration priorities that they have determined are important to them locally. So we help them find funding programs. We help develop information and resources and tools that help build their capacity to take on implementing programs that will improve the environmental quality and the quality of life in their communities. And Paul, do you want to kick us off with the slides?
Okay, for today's agenda, we'll go through the purpose of today's workshop. We'll go over very quickly what you need to do to get prepared to address a federal funding opportunity. We're going to introduce the funding opportunity and talk about eligibility and how you can determine that. We're going to talk about example projects that you might want to consider, developing the application, and where to find additional information and support. And I like this cartoon. Our proposal didn't get the grant, but they want us to teach proposal writing. Proposal writing is like a batter's hitting percentage. If you know anything about baseball at any level, you know that a batter who hits 300 is a good batter, but 300 is only 30%. So in the time that I worked for the University of Texas, I worked on teams that probably submitted $140 million worth of applications, and we were fortunate to get $40 million worth of funding. But that's not 30%. But grant writing is, you have to be persistent, and you have to be passionate about the idea that you have. And this just gives background about SIEGE and the Environmental Finance Center. And you can Google the Environmental Finance Center or SIEGE and get as much information as you want. But if you've heard Dr. Wilson talk, you know that SIEGE is all about community engagement, environmental justice, and health. And he's a very prolific grant developer, and all of his grants respond to those three notions. Because of the funding that we've received, both SIEGE and the EFC, the Environmental Finance Center, one of our obligations is to provide technical assistance to fence line and frontline communities that we're able to identify. And in fact, this presentation is taking place partly in fulfillment of the EPA Thriving Community Technical Assistance Center grant and the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Hub grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So in a sense, this is part of the technical assistance that we are obligated to provide to y'all during this time. The purpose of this workshop will be that we will walk through an actual proposal, talking about the different elements and components, hopefully sharing some tips and tricks of the trade with you. I can tell you, no matter how many grant writing workshops I've been to, I always learn something new. And even though I've only worked with Dr. Wilson since last December, he's taught me more about grant writing than I ever thought that I would learn for the rest of my life. He's very prolific. With regard to learning objectives, hopefully you will feel more comfortable in reviewing and working with an actual RFP. You will begin to be able to determine whether your organization is eligible for a funding opportunity. Hopefully, you will learn how to begin to incorporate some of the grant writing tips from the first and second workshops that we presented. That's why I handed out those handouts to you. I'm sort of old school. I feel like you have to give something to put in people's hands. In reviewing the USDA request for proposals, participants will learn how to prioritize the various grant development activities. And you'll begin to think about and learn how to work with partners, collaborators, and subawardees. And I forgot to say, if any of you have any questions at any time, please stop. We'll try to define all of the various acronyms that we use. If we forget to do that, please raise your hand and I'll go back and do that. A little advice up front. And this is something I always, this is a point that I'm very passionate about. Going into a proposal, you need to know what motivates you. What are you most passionate about? What is the project or the idea that you want funding? It's most important for you to look for a funding opportunity that fits what you want to do, because it's going to take emotional, physical, and intellectual energy over a long period of time. So you need to make sure that the funding opportunity that you pursue is one that is going to respond to what you are most passionate about. And I always tell people, the idea is the heart and soul of the application. Your idea, what you want to do, is what really is most important. And so if you're very clear about what you want to do with whatever amount of money you want to get, that will be your guiding light in the process. And the question I would like to ask, and this is not required if you answered it or not, but I'm just wondering if any of you have led an effort in your organization to write a proposal, or do you know someone who has been successful that can mentor you? Has anyone here written a proposal? Okay, great. In the course of the presentation, since you've written a proposal, if you have any suggestions to make about any of the topics that we bring up, please feel free just to raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you, because we want you to, we want everyone to benefit from your experience as well as ours. If you've not written a proposal, do you know someone who can mentor you? Okay.
Great, thanks, Paul. So I don't disagree with you at all, Paul, that pulling a proposal together takes a lot of mental and emotional and intellectual energy. The exciting thing is that even if you haven't identified exactly what funding program you want to go after, there are some things you can start to pull together so that when you find that opportunity, that you're ready to go. You don't have to slog through some of the early steps. And especially if you're going to be looking at federal funding programs, you want to make sure that you're registered in grants.gov. This is the database of all federal funding programs. It's, enables you to search for grants and funding opportunities. It also has resources on how to search for grants, how to develop a grant, what kind of eligibilities there are, lots of grant tips, grant writing tips and tricks. It's also the application portal for most federal programs. So making sure that you're registered in grants.gov is an important first step that you can do before you've even identified a program that you want to take your project to. But to register in grants.gov, you need a unique entity ID. And so that means before you go to grants.gov, you want to go to sam.gov, which is the System for Award Management. And that's what the federal government uses to track who's receiving federal funding. So anybody who's going to apply for federal dollars is going to need to be registered in both systems. And as part of your registration in the SAM system, this System for Award Management, you're going to get a unique entity ID. That's going to be the number that the federal government uses. Everything that you do that involves federal funding is going to fall under this number. It's like having a social security number, but it's specific for grants, federal grants. So that's what validates your organization for the federal government. So those are two really important steps. They say that going through the SAM system takes 7 to 10 days. And so once you go through the SAM system, and if that takes 7 to 10 days, and then you go to grants.gov to register, and that takes a few more days, that's a lot of valuable time in your proposal development timeline that you don't want to lose. And for the SAM, once you're in grants.gov, you're good, but when the SAM, you have to renew every 12 months. And then there's a couple of sort of proposal content sections that you can work on. Most proposals ask for some sort of statement about your programmatic capability, which is really just a fancy way of saying your qualifications to do the work that you are proposing to do. So that's going to be information like the history of your organization, your staff bios and your staff resumes, and that's your previous experience with doing the types of projects that you are proposing to do in your proposal. So those are some of the things that you can start assembling before you even know what program you want to go after, because those are things that aren't going to change about your organization. You may need to tweak it a little depending on your project, but having that in your back pocket that you can cut and paste once you're starting to write that proposal can be really handy. And the other piece that we talk about in terms of having something ready to go is past performance, especially with the federal government. They want to know about your history of successfully managing grants, similar to the scale of what you're asking for and the type of project that you're proposing to do. So that's not so much about your knowledge base of the content area. That is more about, did you deliver the final products that you thought you were going to deliver? Did you do a good job of balancing how much work you were doing with how much spending you were doing? Did you do a good job of getting your reporting, your quarterly or your annual reporting done on time? So it's more about the mechanics of managing that grant. And that's another thing that you can have prepared all ready to go. So again, we had just a couple of questions, just out of curiosity. So does anybody in the room already have a grants.gov and SAM number? All right. So you're ahead of the curve already. All right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so they're using these unique identifiers now instead of the DUNS. In the SAM.gov website, you can search to double check and see if you've done it already or not. So there is a ability to check on that. And then, for those of you that haven't, it becomes about identifying, taking on the task or identifying someone on your team that can do those registrations. And again, great to get them done in advance so that you're not having that clock ticking while you're trying to pull your proposal together. And Paul, I think that kicks it back over to you, sir.
There are lots of cartoons about grant writing. Who would have thought? And one of them that I found was really relevant to this talk. The guy says to his colleague, the money for this grant proposal is probably coming from the Department of Agriculture. So make sure to use words like yonder, mosey, y'all, that sort of thing. Do not do that. Okay. One of my most important tips is that, and I learned this at the University of Texas at Austin. I had a professor who said, don't give me anything that you've written that hasn't been looked at by anyone else. I only want to see work that's been edited. Even if it's edited by your teenage daughter, you give it to someone. And we all ended up editing our own work and not giving it to our teenage daughter because none of us had a teenage daughter, but it's true. Whatever you write, whatever I write, will be improved if someone else looks at it. Without a doubt. It doesn't matter if you have a high school education or a PhD. It will always be improved if someone else looks at it, because someone will say, I don't understand what this means. And that is so helpful, because the people who review and evaluate grant proposals are many times not experts in the field. And so if you can have someone identify for you something that is not as clear as you would like it to be, that's really helpful. This particular RFP that we're looking at, it's due on October 30th. And so if you are interested in what this RFP funds, or if you know someone who would be interested, you can forward this information to them, and they still have time to put together an application. So whenever you look at an RFP, you see there's going to be a due date, and this due date is October 30th at 5:00 p.m. The due date is not October 30th, 5:01 p.m. And one of my darkest moments as a grant writer is that I submitted a grant 3 minutes before it was due, and it was not received by grants.gov until 4 minutes after it was due. And within 15 minutes, I received notification that my request for $400,000 was not going to be reviewed, was not eligible for funding, because it had arrived after the deadline. That is very painful. You need to know upfront that everyone in the world waits for the last minute. And the computer systems cannot handle last minute requests. And so at the University of Maryland, I think we have to get it in we have to get it into the Office of Research Administration like 7 days before it's due or something like that. That's to ensure that the application is submitted on time. But please try to remember to submit it at least 24 hours in advance. Okay, there's not a lot of funding for this particular program. It's $4,800,000. And the individual award ranges are between $25,000 and $400,000. And the funding opportunity number is as you see it there. Okay, the purpose of this program, and it's important for you to understand, it's important for any applicant to understand what the purpose is. It is to meet the food needs of low-income individuals through food distribution, community outreach, to assist in participation in federally assisted nutrition programs, or improve access to food as part of a comprehensive service. Several presentations on environmental justice problems having to do with food have talked about food deserts. That's what this program is basically aimed at reducing. Increase the self-reliance of communities in providing for the food needs of the communities, and promote comprehensive responses to local food access, farm, and nutrition issues. And when I first saw this, I thought, what does that mean? Okay, I mean, the program purpose causes a lot of questions. You can buy equipment, you can plan for long-term solutions, innovative marketing activities that benefit producers and low-income consumers. But still, I have a lot of questions. And as you go through an RFP, if you have questions, you should be writing them down, because with federal programs, normally the program officers are experts in the funding opportunity. And so you should really utilize their expertise. And there's no such thing as a dumb question. You want to see the previous slide? That one? That is an excellent question, and that is a question that occurred to me because my own church has a food pantry. And my church's food pantry is becoming overwhelmed because 2 other churches nearby, different denominations, had food pantries that closed down. They opened up during COVID, and then they closed down recently. So the people who were over there and those food, taking advantage of those food pantries, are coming to us. So that is one of my questions throughout the RFP. Would this program fund like a collaboration of church-based food pantries? Because we know that a number of churches do have food pantries. So that's a question, and we might be addressing it in the evaluation criteria, but that's an excellent question to be written down as we go through the RFP.
I do think the way that the RFP is written, it has to be those first 3 bullet points, or it can be the next 3 bullet points about equipping efficient operations, planning for long-term solutions, and creation of innovative marketing activities. So, you know, it says that it has to be those federally oriented things, or it has to meet specific state, local, neighborhood, food, and agriculture needs. So I think that opens the door for what you're describing.
Thank you, Jen. But always, 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 if you have even the smallest of doubts, consult with the program officer, get the response to your question in writing. And many times there's an FAQ section related with each of the funding opportunities, frequently asked questions. So you should consult there first. I mean, when I've not gone to the FAQs and I've gone right to the program officers, normally I receive a response that said, hey, we answered that in the FAQs. So that's just. Well, the cardinal rule in grant writing is read the RFP. You know. What is that? Oh, definitely have several readers read it. Okay, so they have two tracks, one for planning projects and one for community food projects. And then they describe the planning projects and they describe the community food projects. The planning projects have to do with startup projects, improving the food security in the community, looking at the need, documenting the need, and what activities are going to take place. So normally, I mean, I think we're going to see that the planning projects have less money associated with them. And if you want people to get more food, or if you want to make food more available, or if you feel like you have a good system already for food distribution, then you need to consider the community food projects. And it says here that the monies are not to support individual food pantries or community gardens, but looking at long-term solutions. So obviously they're looking at collaborations, because that's the only way you can implement a long-term solution. And then they give you the parameters of the funding opportunity. And you can see that it's a one-time award. It can't exceed 3 years. And it's basically for $25,000. And then the community food projects can go on for 2 years. The minimum award is $125,000 over 12 months, and the maximum award is $400,000 over 48 months. And again, it's a one-time contribution of federal dollars. And both of these funding opportunities come with a match requirement, which some organizations consider daunting, but what I believe that I have learned is that those funding opportunities that have match requirements make people think, oh, I don't want to do the work to justify a match. That's too difficult. I just want the money outright. I don't want to go through the process of evaluating what I'm bringing to the table. So this is not always true, but I believe that when there is a match, it sometimes reduces the competition. So if you have a lot of personnel, a lot of space, a lot of resources that you're putting into the project already, and you can put a value on that, I think it's worth it to go through the process of really determining if you can come up with a match. The key application dates. There's a webinar, informational webinars, which more and more are going on now. And it's very important to look at the webinar. They answer a lot of questions. Plus, they inspire questions. Again, the deadline is 11:59 p.m. on October 30th. Not midnight, but 11:59. And they're telling you that there's going to be at least a 6-month delay between the time that you submit the grant and when the projects are going to begin.
So who's going to be eligible to apply for these dollars? They had set up a couple of eligibility criteria. Bless you. First of all, you have to be at least one of these things as an organization. You have to be a public food program, service provider, tribal organization, or private nonprofit entity. And you have to have experience in community food work, particularly small and mid-sized farms, or job training and business development for low-income communities, or working to reduce food insecurity in the community with things like food distribution or improving access or coordinating services. So if you're talking about, your food pantry, that sounds a lot like coordinating services. So you have to click one of the, you have to check one of those boxes. And then you must also demonstrate competency to implement the project you're proposing. This is coming back to that past performance language that we talked about developing. You have to demonstrate a willingness to share what you've learned over the course of your project. And so that's saying to me, okay, I need to have a section in my proposal that talks about my communications plan. Am I going to do webinars or brown bags or go to conferences? Am I going to develop case studies? Am I going to have a blog or do some videos or do some, infographics? They want to know, how are you going to make their investment in your project? How are you going to raise the profile of that? And how are you going to make sure that the good things that you've done can get replicated by other communities so that everyone can be learning from each other? This particular RFP did not have language about what is an ineligible organization. But again, coming back to what Paul said earlier, if you have any question about whether you're eligible or not, whether you, whether you think your project is a good fit, any questions at all, you want to go to that program officer and ask some questions, check the FAQs, and then go to that program officer. And for the most part, the program officers want to hear from you before they see your proposal. You don't want that proposal to be a cold call. They want to see that. They want to be able to give you some input. They don't want you spinning your wheels. They don't want the reviewers spinning their wheels on something that isn't quite right. So definitely take advantage of that opportunity to check in with the program officers. Now, for your application to be eligible for review, again, you have to meet that deadline. You have to meet the eligibility requirements we just talked about. You can only submit one proposal. You cannot submit. You may have multiple project ideas, but you got to pick the best one for this one, because they're not going. This one particularly is not going to allow for multiple proposals. They also want the applications to be written entirely in English. If it's not in English, it's going to get bounced, whether it's a good proposal or not. And then coming back to that conversation around cost share, this requires a dollar for dollar match, and that can be a little intimidating. But it also, being able to demonstrate match is telling the funder that you're bringing resources to the table too. You're not just looking for a handout. You're looking for something that you can leverage with what you are already bringing to the table. So cash match is when you're actually bringing dollars to the table. So perhaps you have a grant from a philanthropic organization that's doing similar work, and you're going to go after the federal dollars and you're going to match it with those philanthropic dollars. You cannot match federal dollars with federal dollars, even if it's from a different federal agency. So those philanthropic dollars can be good cash match. And then there's all kinds of different in-kind match. So that's not cash, right? That's things like volunteer time, that there are actual calculations of what the value of an hour of volunteer time is. And so you can say, we're going to have X number of volunteers providing X amount of time at this rate, and that can become part of your match. Perhaps if you're doing an implementation project that involves putting something into the ground or building something, if you had equipment loaned to you, or if the municipality that your food pantry is in is going to donate equipment that you can use, that is another valuable way of developing some match. Or maybe a local grocery store is going to be donating food supplies for stocking your food pantry, or a local nursery is going to donate some plants for a community garden or something. So those are also all kinds of ways. You'd be surprised once you start chipping away at it how you can develop match pretty quickly. And then they talk a little bit about what kind of activities are eligible and what kind of activities are ineligible. And so they give some examples for the planning grants about some of the eligible activities. And again, if you're not sure if your activity fits this package, then you want to talk to that project officer. But they're talking about mapping food, and doing assessments, mapping where community food systems are, coordinating and developing collaborations, doing some sort of GIS analysis, food sovereignty studies, farm to institution. These are the kinds of projects that are going to help inform, should you choose to look at doing some sort of implementation project down the line. So these are, this is assembling the necessary information to make sure that the project you're proposing is actually going to solve the problem you're trying to address. Again, everything with a focus on low-income communities. And then on the actual implementation grants, they talk about community gardens. farmers markets, marketing cooperatives. And this may sound a little bit like it's in conflict with what they said earlier about not just a community garden, not just a farmer's market. I think they're talking about what Paul indicated earlier. They're talking about doing those things in terms of a collaboration, creating a network of these things, and perhaps some peer-to-peer learning across those things. And then they have a list of ineligible activities, which aren't exactly, I won't read through the whole list, but they're not exactly shocking. These are things that are pretty common in the federal list of ineligible activities. You know, you can't have the cost of entertainment. You can't, unfortunately, you can no longer do cash or gift cards. For this particular program, you can't do cash or gift cards to compensate your participants. No lobbying, that's pretty general. That's not unusual at all. You can't have the cost of a membership in an organization. No promotional items. So if you were going to do something with farmers markets and you wanted to give them those tote bags to be able to, reusable tote bags, not allowable under this particular award, but maybe it's allowable under your philanthropic award. And so maybe that part of what you wanted to do gets, goes into the philanthropic, and that becomes match for your federal stuff. No fundraising, no infrastructure construction. And those are, again, not unusual. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. It's yeah. So paying for that with the federal dollars, it's ineligible, but it doesn't. You can still use that as match, because it's resources that are being invested in the same project. It's just coming from a different source that has that as an allowable cost. Yep. Sure. And Paul, I think you're back up. 34.
I like this cartoon because there are lots of hoops to jump through. And welcome to the grant application process. And that's why I think that it's very important to get started early, because you know that there are going to be a lot of hoops, and get the hoops out of the way that you know are going to be there in the end. There are lots of federal forms that are required for federal grant applications. And that's why some people prefer to go through the private philanthropical route or state grants. State applications sometimes are easier. Another thing that happens, especially with food grants that I know of, is that counties apply. So every county in Maryland, I'm absolutely sure, has a planning department with someone who's working on grants. And you can find that person and talk to them and say, hey, what grants do you have going on that are related to the distribution of food? And if you have one of those grants in process, can my organization be a collaborator of yours? I think that sometimes we forget that counties are looking for people to collaborate with because they're obligated to. I know that the Environmental Finance Center has to do a certain amount of community engagement and outreach. And so they're grateful when people communicate with them and say, hey, can you give us some technical assistance? Because then they can say, okay, we're fulfilling our obligation under the grant that we've received. And the Center for Engagement in Environmental Justice is fully supported by external funding. So this presentation today and the whole symposium is technical assistance and community engagement. And we're required to do that under the grants that we've received. I think the Environmental Finance Center, you're pretty much funded externally, aren't you? Okay, so the Environmental Finance Center is also funded 100% by external funding. I'm not going to go through all of the forms, but one form that is really important for you to look at is the SF 424, simply because the SF 424 is a form. I can't think of any federal grant that doesn't require an SF 424. And it has a lot of requests for demographic information, employer identification numbers, AORs, which is the authorized organization representative. I mean, there's sometimes a question about whether the executive director is the authorized organization representative or the president of the board of directors. But if you just click on the SF 424 and see what information is required, it'll help you to get your wheels spinning and to fill in that form. There are a number of forms, obviously, here that USDA requires that the EPA does not require. The EPA requires some other supplementary forms. So I'm not going to go through all of the forms except to say it would behoove anyone considering the development of an application to look at the forms to see how involved they are. Some are like really simple. Like I'm sure the felony conviction and tax delinquent status is pretty simple to fill out. You know, is someone in your organization a felon, and are you delinquent on your taxes? And I just learned that sometimes when an organization does work for the state of Maryland and submits an invoice, that invoice is not paid in a timely manner because the person who signs the invoice owes taxes to the state of Maryland or may owe alimony to the state of Maryland, or there's some other red flag on this individual's personal record, which may or may not be correct, you know. So really look at the forms long before you have to fill them out. Okay, the project summary is described here, and they're going to give you 250 words to describe your project goals and objectives, activities, and how your proposal may be relevant to their priorities. And they even give you a template, so you should look at the template. Okay, you're going to need to write a narrative. And text, tables, and figures cannot exceed 15 pages. They're very precise. And I'm surprised it doesn't say here, but most of the time they give you 1-inch margins, and they say 8.5 by 11 pages, and I mean, some are very, very precise. But here it says 1.5 spacing is required. On different grants, it's just single spacing. But if you don't comply with these technical requirements, out you go. You're not going to be reviewed. They even tell you what fonts are acceptable and how many points the text has to be. So this is very typical of the federal government. The font requirements are 12 points, and then they say no smaller than 11. So my question is, what is it, 11 or 12? But this is so typical of of a federal RFP. Okay, the community is involved and needs to be addressed. So you need to describe how the community is collaborating. What are the organizations and communities involved? I know of very, very, very few federal requests for proposals now that do not absolutely demand collaboration. And when collaboration is demanded, you're going to need to get a letter of commitment from the organization. So that takes time up front. What are your project goals and objectives? And in the previous workshops, we talked about goals and objectives. Activities to achieve goals, relationship to program objectives. Normally what they're talking about here is develop a logic model. And in the previous two grant writing workshops, we talked about logic models. And really, I'm a strong proponent of logic models, because if you can do a logic model before you start writing, before you invest a bunch of time in this, you've really given yourself a leg up. If you know what your inputs are going to be, what your outputs are going to be, and who you're addressing, who you're going to help, your audience, and what your outcomes might be, that's a tremendous guide. So I strongly suggest working on logic models as soon as possible. Okay, with regard to narratives and community food projects, the community involved needs to be addressed. Oh, we've talked about, organizations need to be involved. Intended outcomes, again. I mean, basically they're saying, they haven't said it here, but basically they're saying is, we want to see a logic model. I mean, that, and if you ever see some wording in an RFP that says strongly suggest, you should just interpret that as meaning mandatory or required. Because if they strongly suggest something, they really want to see it. Evaluation strategy. Oh, here they say logic models are encouraged. And then self-sustainability. How are you going to sustain your project? That's really, really, really important. One thing I would like to say about evaluation strategy is that one trick that I mention as a possibility to organizations that don't have a lot of money to put into grant writing, and unfortunately the federal government, you can't put grant writing in your budget, you know, or pre-award activities in your budget. But one thing, I worked as a private consultant for a very short period, and I used to tell the people I worked with, you don't need to pay me up front, but if you want me to help you to develop a grant, then you need to put me in as an evaluator. So I would only get paid if the grant was successful. I mean, some grant writers will work under those conditions. Some want to get paid up front, but that's a way to get someone for free up front to help you to develop a grant. Okay, outputs and outcomes are very important, and we've given you an example here. And to simplify things, I like to suggest to people that they think about their own lives. And if you're responsible, or if you've ever been responsible for raising a child, for instance, there are inputs, right? You send them to school, you send them to the doctor, you provide food, you provide shelter. Those are all the inputs that you give. The outputs are the child is healthy, the child makes his or her way through school, etc. And that's the output. The outcomes, the short-term outcome is the child graduates from elementary school. The intermediate outcome is that the child graduates from high school. The long-term outcome is the child gets a job, gets a career, gets training. So some people are really intimidated by logic models, outputs and outcomes. And I like to mention to them how those things are applicable in their own lives, and how outputs, outcomes, and logic models are basically what we do intuitively, how we structure our lives without thinking about it. Here an output is 20 nutrition classes will be held by the end of 12 months. That's an output. Okay? The input is someone gives those classes. You know, there's someone in our organization who's qualified to give those classes, so that's an input. The outcome is that disadvantaged youth will improve their health. Okay. Another output might be everyone gets vaccinated, or everyone gets the appropriate number of and kind of vaccinations. So you have inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And that's basically what the logic model is. I really like this example of a milestone because it's very, very simple. It's very easy to read. It's not complicated. And grant reviewers like things that are not complicated, because normally they're reading 10 to 20 grant applications. And the clearer that you can be, the better. And so you see that under this objective, they're going to reach those milestones that are listed on those dates. And then the next objective, those activities and those dates. I mean, a milestone chart doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. Now, if you don't like this model, you can Google milestones and come up with 100 different varieties, 100 different versions of what a milestone chart might look like. And you can do that for anything that we're talking about today. Okay, evaluation. One of the things you need to determine is whether you are going to do the evaluation in-house with your people, or whether you're going to hire an external evaluator. And it's really your preference. Sometimes an external evaluator will help you with your logic model. You know, if you contract with an external evaluator. When I was at the University of Texas, we had a wonderful person in the College of Education, and we always wrote this individual into our grants as an evaluator because we knew that he would help us up front to develop a good evaluation plan. But it's not required. Okay. What are the short-term and long-term outcomes that need to be evaluated? How does the project measure your progress? How do you know if you're moving ahead? Are there specific measures associated with your outputs and outcomes? I mean, you can't just say some individual is going to teach some number of classes in some kind of a subject. You know, I mean, the more specific you can be, the better. How do the outcomes relate to the program goals? And you'll see that everything should be tied together. Everything should be related with each other. And then, are the target measures reasonable and achievable? And this reminds me of one admonition that I always give to people developing grants, and that is and we used to say this at the University of Texas, the only thing worse than not getting funded is getting funded, because getting funded equals more work. Okay, and I have never worked on a proposal where a funded proposal always takes more work than you anticipate. Okay, so please be extremely conservative when you're thinking about how much money you need to put in your budget for personnel, and then double it, because it takes a lot of energy. A lot of unanticipated labor is involved in carrying out a grant. And I see this gentleman nodding his head. So it's a lesson that anyone who's been involved in managing a grant understands. It's a lot of work. And here is the simplest logic model template that you can find. Resources are inputs. These are the activities that you're going to carry out. These are the outputs. Who are you going to involve? And then the outcomes. And so it's inputs, outputs, outcomes at the bottom. This is like the simplest, most straightforward logic model that you can possibly imagine.
Quick time check, Paul. We're at 4:23, and I know folks are going to want to get to the final plenary session. So,
yes. Well, here are the other the other attachments with this proposal, and the question is, why are letters of commitment better than letters of support? Does anyone have an answer? Excellent. Exactly. They're making a commitment to participate. The old model was letters of support. Get a letter of support. Well, anyone or their mother can write a letter of support, but letters of commitment, and the great thing about letters of commitment is that the commitment that's made in the letter can be used in the budget justification, and it can be used in the narrative. So it really serves three purposes.
all right, I think that's to me. I will be mindful of the fact that you all probably want to get to see the final session. So we'll go through this budget component relatively quickly, but if anyone wants to talk about it more, I can certainly stay after and talk about it. So the budget that you're going to put together, they really want to see a good amount of detail. They really want to understand they want to know that you've given thought to how you're going to spend every dollar that you're asking for. And so it's personnel and fringe benefits. Benefits are probably your biggest line item in your budget, depending on what kind of project it is. This is, you want to get specific with this. We're going to have this person get this much money to spend this much of their time working on these specific tasks within. And you're going to need to do that for each of the people in your organization that are going to be a part of the project. And then you're going to want to be doing something similar with the benefits dollars. The program manager gets this % of benefits And they're going to know why. They're going to want to know how those percentages for benefits were arrived at. So, for example, with the university, they have federally negotiated benefits rates, and they're different for staff versus hourly folks versus faculty. So you just want to be able to defend where those numbers are coming from. And then your travel. So you're going to want to be being detailed. We're going, X numbers of miles round trip, X number of times to visit these communities who are going to be a part of the program, and what mileage rate and where is that coming from. And then equipment. I think equipment is something that rarely ends up being a part of these things, because equipment is defined by the federal government as equipment has to be over $5,000. And so even if you're buying a laptop, it's still considered a supply and not equipment. So we don't usually get into equipment too much. We'll talk a little bit about contractual, if you're going to have to bring in an evaluator like Paul was suggesting, or if you're going to need a bookkeeper or a data processor, an engineer. Those are the kinds of things that you'll want to map out in contractual, and you'll want to be able to explain how you arrived at that price for that contractor. And you're also going to want to talk about, if they're for-profit firms, you're going to want to be able to talk about how you competitively put folks through a competitive process to get to that contractor, or how you plan to do a competitive process for the for-profits. Next we have, I skipped over supplies. Sorry about that. So supplies, if you're buying paper to be able to print things, or if you have to buy a laptop to be able to operate your project. Those are the kinds of things that are going to end up in supplies. If you're doing air quality monitoring and you need to buy some monitors, or water quality and you want to buy some water quality monitors, those are all the things that are going to end up in supplies. And then there's another catch-all called other. That's if you have perhaps a nonprofit that's going to be a partner, and they're going to have a sub-award with you. That's where that line item would go. Or if you're going to have participant support costs that you want to be able to compensate, well, I guess not in this particular RFP. That's not an allowable cost. Exactly. So, but those are the types of things that end up falling into that other category. If you're having copies of outreach materials printed, if you're doing sub-awards, yep, we talked about sub-awards. And then finally, your indirect costs. You want to make sure that you are allowing for the operational expenses that are associated with being able to do the project. You may have a federally negotiated rate that you can use. The RFPs usually talk about an alternate rate if you don't have a federally negotiated rate, but you definitely want to make sure that you're accommodating for that. And then we were intending to ask you guys about what tips and tricks have really worked for you. We can certainly still do that, but while we're thinking about what tips and tricks that you all have found successful, I will put one more reminder out there that both Paul's organization and mine do still have some technical assistance dollars. So if any of this is interesting to you or to any of your colleagues, just reach out to us. Here's also our contact info. Just reach out to us and we'd be happy to talk with you further, whether that's just talking through some things or whether we want to roll up our sleeves and try and bang some of this out together. The technical assistance can take a lot of shapes and forms.
And I would say to one of the things we are going to do on the SIEGE website is we are going to continue to put up information about grants that are relevant to environmental justice projects. So as we've mentioned before, this workshop and the symposium is being conducted to fulfill an objective of a grant, and that is to do community outreach and provide technical assistance. And so please do not hesitate to communicate with us by email. Probably would be the easiest way to do it, about your questions with regard to grants, grant development, etc. Because sometimes we hear from people who say, I'm looking for such and such a partner, but I can't find them. Or I would like to collaborate with someone who's interested in a project like this? Do you know of anyone? So it's really important for you to make yourself known to us and make your projects known to us, because we would like to link you up with other people with whom you might collaborate. And in the grant world, one plus one is always more than two, because of the synergy and the leveraging of resources. So thank you very much, and please don't be strangers. And we hope that you've had a good symposium, and we're almost at the end of the show.
Yes, thank
Hello,
you all.
Vivek. We're done. Okay.
Thank you all so much for spending some time with us. If you found the handouts helpful,